Wow, what a powerful story of dedication and service. It's incredible to see how true loyalty still makes a difference. But now, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow, we have an even more incredible story lined up that you won't want to miss. See you in the next one. Developers wanted his farm, but the Pentagon said no. For as long as he could remember, James Carter had worked the same land his grandfather once tilled. At 70 years old, he still woke up before dawn, stepping onto his 2,500-acre farm in Oklahoma, just as he had done every morning for the past 50 years. But this wasn't just any farm, it was a piece of American history. 3 generations of Carters had maintained the land, not just for crops, but for something much bigger. In the far southern field, James kept a landing zone clear for military helicopters. It wasn't something the government had asked for, his family had volunteered. His father, a Korean War veteran, started the tradition, just like his grandfather had done during World War II. For decades, their farm had been a safe haven for pilots needing to practice emergency landings and night operations. James never saw it as an obligation. To him, it was simply his way of serving his country. Every week, the roaring sound of helicopter blades filled the sky as pilots from a nearby base flew in to train. Some were fresh recruits, nervous and eager to learn. Others were seasoned aviators, preparing for their next mission overseas. No matter their experience, James was always there, making sure the landing lights were set up, the path was clear, and the field was ready. His wife, Linda, played just as important a role. She knew that training could last for hours, and soldiers couldn't perform at their best on an empty stomach. So, she always had fresh coffee and homemade sandwiches waiting in their kitchen. "You can't send our boys off to serve the country without a good meal," she'd say with a warm smile. James never asked for recognition, never expected a thank you. His satisfaction came from knowing he was doing his part. Even during harvest season, when every second counted, he always left the landing zone untouched. "Corn can wait," he'd say, "but military readiness can't." For half a century, Carter Farm had quietly served the country. To James, it wasn't just land, it was a legacy of service and sacrifice. He never imagined that one day, it would all be at risk. But change was coming fast, and soon, the farm that had trained generations of pilots would face its greatest challenge yet. For 50 years, James Carter had dedicated his land to supporting the military. He never asked for anything in return, never expected recognition. But one day, everything changed. A real estate developer called Next Gen Developments had purchased thousands of acres surrounding Carter Farm. Their plan? A massive tech campus, one that would turn the quiet farmland into a sprawling complex of glass buildings, corporate offices, and parking lots. At first, James didn't think much of it. "They'll build their fancy buildings, and I'll keep running my farm," he told Linda, brushing off the news. But then, the letters started coming. At first, it was a polite offer, a generous sum, well above market value, if James agreed to sell. He barely glanced at the paper before tossing it aside. His farm wasn't for sale. Not at any price. A few weeks later, the letters became more aggressive. The company insisted that the land wasn't being used to its full potential. They made it clear, Carter Farm stood in the way of their multi-billion-dollar project. Then came the county notices. Rezoning efforts. Environmental impact studies. New land use regulations. Bureaucratic red tape, all aimed at forcing James out. The same land that had trained generations of helicopter pilots was now being labeled as underdeveloped property. The irony made James sick. At night, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction warnings, his hands gripping the edges of the paper. "How can they just erase all this?" he muttered, shaking his head. Across from him, Linda reached for his hand. She knew how much the farm meant to him. How much it meant to the military. And it wasn't just their farm. Down the road, their neighbors, the Wilson family, had already sold their 500-acre emergency landing zone. The Montgomerys, who had always provided resting space for military crews between training sessions, were packing up too. One by one, the surrounding farms were disappearing, swallowed up by NextGen's unstoppable expansion. James refused to go down without a fight. The military needed this land. The pilots needed this land. He needed this land. But as he looked at the final notice taped to his front door, he realized something terrifying. He was running out of time. James Carter had fought many battles in his life: bad weather, tough harvests, and long nights maintaining the landing zone for the military. But this fight was different. This wasn't against nature. This was against men in suits, armed with contracts and legal loopholes. The final notice had arrived that morning. 60 days. That's all he had left before Carter Farm would be forced into foreclosure. It didn't matter that he'd paid his taxes on time for 50 years. It didn't matter that pilots had been using his field for training since his father's day. All that mattered to NextGen Developments was that his land stood in the way of their corporate empire. James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the paper. The eviction date felt like a death sentence. Linda placed a warm hand on his shoulder, but for once, he had no words. The farm wasn't just their home, it was a legacy. It was service. It was history. That afternoon, with hands trembling, James took an old wooden sign from the barn. He dragged it to the edge of the field, where the helicopters used to land, and with bold, black paint, he wrote, "Military Training Zone Closing, Carter Farm, serving our troops since 1945. Underneath, in smaller letters, he added, "Thank you for 50 years of service to our country." As he stepped back, something in his chest tightened. For the first time, it all felt real. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was the end. At first, no one paid attention to the sign. But a young local journalist, passing through town, stopped to take a picture. She knocked on the Carter's door, asking about the farm's history, about the pilots who trained here, about what the military meant to them. James told her everything. How his grandfather first cleared this land for training during World War II. How his father kept it open during Vietnam. How he himself had spent decades ensuring that young pilots had a safe place to practice. The reporter published the story the next morning. James didn't expect much. Maybe a few locals would read it. Maybe some pilots would remember. But then, something happened that he never saw coming. The story went viral. James Carter had no idea his story was spreading. He still woke up before dawn, still tended the land, and still set up the landing lights, even though the helicopters had stopped coming. He thought maybe a few pilots would see the article and remember the farm, but beyond that, what could one man do against a billion-dollar corporation? Then, the phone rang. Not his cell phone. He didn't own one, but his old landline, the same one his father had used to radio pilots decades ago. When he picked it up, a serious voice said, "Mr. Carter, please hold for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." James nearly dropped the receiver. For a moment, he thought it was a prank. Maybe one of his old army buddies was messing with him. But when the next voice came on the line, deep and steady, he knew this was real. "Mr. Carter, I saw the story about your farm. Tell me about it." James took a breath, his hands shaking. And then, he told the man everything. He spoke about the long nights, setting up landing lights so young pilots could practice touch-and-go exercises in the dark. He spoke about watching those same pilots become skilled aviators, some of them going on to fly in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. He spoke about his wife, Linda, baking sandwiches and coffee for exhausted military crews. He didn't talk about politics. He didn't talk about money. He just talked about service. When he finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the chairman said something that made James' chest tighten. "We can't lose training grounds like yours. Give me 24 hours. The call ended. James stood there, frozen, gripping the phone. Linda walked in from the kitchen. "Who was that?" she asked, concerned. James turned to her, still in shock. "That was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff," he said. "And he's going to help save the farm." For the first time in months, a spark of hope flickered in his heart. James didn't know what would happen next, but deep down, he knew everything was about to change. James Carter barely slept that night. His mind raced with questions. Could one phone call really change anything? Would the military step in? Or was this just another empty promise? The next morning, just as the sun peeked over the horizon, he heard it, the deep, unmistakable thump of helicopter blades. James stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. Over the treetops, an Apache helicopter led the way, followed by 3 Black Hawks. But these weren't the usual training crews. As the helicopters descended onto his landing zone, James saw official military markings. 2 high-ranking generals stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their expressions serious. James' heart pounded as one of them approached, hand extended. "Mr. Carter, we're here to make sure this farm stays exactly where it belongs, serving the United States military." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. He led the officers inside, where Linda quickly poured coffee, just like she'd done for so many soldiers before. At the kitchen table, the generals laid out official documents. They explained that, effective immediately, Carter Farm would be designated as a protected military training site. This meant no developer, no zoning law, no corporate interest could ever touch it. "Sign here, Mr. Carter," one of them said, sliding the paperwork across the table. James stared at the documents, his hands trembling. He had spent months thinking he was about to lose everything. Now, with just a few strokes of a pen, his farm, and its legacy, would be safe forever. As he signed, the general smiled. "The chairman wanted us to tell you something," he said, standing to leave. "Some things are worth more than money. And your service to this country is one of them." Later that day, the military personally delivered orders to next-gen developments, effectively shutting down their expansion plans. No more boardroom meetings. No more aggressive offers. Carter Farm wasn't going anywhere. But it didn't stop there. The Montgomery's Rest Area? Saved. The Wilson's Emergency Landing Zone? Protected. One by one, the surrounding farms were secured, ensuring that military pilots would always have a place to train. Today, James still wakes up before dawn, still clears the landing zone, still watches the helicopters practice their approaches. Only now, his grandson, Tyler, works beside him, learning the family tradition. And in the barn, hanging where he can see it every day, is the old wooden sign he once thought would mark the end of everything. Military Training Zone Closing, serving our troops since 1945. A reminder of how close he came to losing it all. And a reminder that, in the end, loyalty, honor, and service still mean something in this country. United States. We want to hear from you. This story isn't just about one farm, it's about honor, service, and the sacrifices made to support those who protect our country. United States James Carter stood his ground, refusing to let history be erased, and in the end, his dedication paid off. But now, we want to know, what do you think? Do you believe more places like Carter Farm should be protected? Have you or someone you know ever served in the military or supported those who have? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And let us know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our stories travel. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe. We have another incredible story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Because at the end of the day, some things are worth more than money. Let's keep these stories alive, together.